remember where you were when you heard the news that Donald Trump had been elected President of the United States? I have the clearest memory. I was on a remote corner of an island in the Pacific. It was a beautiful morning, and I was settling down for breakfast with the Taliban. With me was fellow Dubliner and Afghan expert, Michael Semple. Michael asked our Taliban guests if Trump's election would make any difference to the search for peace in Afghanistan. No, they replied. In the eyes of the Taliban, Trump was no different to President Obama. How wrong they were. 3 years later, the United States and the Taliban came incredibly close to concluding a peace deal. Such a deal would have ended the longest war in American history, a war that has cost the US dearly, with almost 2,400 troops killed, over 20,000 injured, and around $1 trillion spent. Many other nations have also made sacrifices, including Australia, which has lost 41 soldiers. Of course, the greatest cost has been borne by Afghans, with over 100,000 war dead. Hence, my big idea is this. In war, it is better to talk to your enemy than not. Now, US reluctance to speak with the Taliban is perhaps understandable, given the way they had governed Afghanistan in the 1990s. At the time, the country was racked by civil war, and there was endemic abuse of civilians by gunmen. The Taliban rose up to bring law and order. However, they also brought a strict form of Islamic rule enforced by harsh punishments. Under the Taliban, all men had to grow beards, women had to wear the burqa, and music was banned, as was toothpaste, oddly enough. People were publicly flogged for minor crimes and mutilated for serious ones. Girls over 8 were not allowed to go to school, and women were largely confined to their homes. The West looked on in horror at the deprivations under Taliban rule. So why would the United States make peace with a regime such as this? The short answer is because it has no choice. Following 9/11, America went to war against the Taliban because they were harboring the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. This is what Al-Qaeda did to New York. In retribution, US warplanes rained down death and destruction. Within just 3 months, the Taliban regime was overthrown and its forces were decimated. Most of the remaining Taliban fled across the border to Pakistan. 4 years later, however, the Taliban returned and began to re-establish themselves in the rural areas of southern and eastern Afghanistan. By 2007, a Taliban insurgency was raging across the country. America responded by sending in ever more troops. Under President Obama, US troop numbers surged to a staggering 100,000 in 2010. And the anti-Taliban coalition included an additional 40,000 soldiers from around the world. And the West funded the creation of a massive Afghan army. Despite pouring troops and aid into Afghanistan, America and her allies were unable to defeat the Taliban. And so in 2014, Western combat forces withdrew, and the United States left behind a small force to train and assist the Afghan army. By 2016, the Taliban had overrun a third of the country, including the northern capital of Kunduz. As America had discovered, the Taliban are unbeatable. Hence, there is no alternative to negotiating an end to the conflict. Now, the White House came to this realization late in the day. The best time to make peace is when you have the upper hand. However, the United States only got serious about peace talks in 2012, by which time US forces were pulling out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban could see this clearly. The US should have entered peace talks 2 years earlier, when US forces were flooding into the country, and the Taliban were under most military pressure. So why did the United States wait so long to enter negotiations? Well, because the American way of war is to utterly defeat an opponent and then to impose a peace. In this way, World War II ended with the atomic bombing of Japanese cities. This was the horrific scene afterwards at Hiroshima. Thus, in Afghanistan, the US military sought to defeat the Taliban first, before handing over to diplomats to sort out the peace. Between 2012 and 2016, Michael Semple and I held a series of talks with senior Taliban figures in secure locations outside of Afghanistan. Why would the Taliban agree to meet with us? At the time, I had done a number of studies for senior US and British commanders. Here I am in Kabul in 2013. The man across the table is US General Joseph Dunford, commander of all international forces in Afghanistan. We had just done a lengthy review of his war plan, and in this photo we are briefing our findings. Semple likewise had advised the US government at the highest level. It was because we had these connections that the Taliban were interested in speaking with us. Our meeting with senior Taliban in 2012 focused on assessing the prospects for peace talks that were due to start in Doha. In advance, I went to Washington, D.C. for discussions with senior US officials. The Americans wanted us to find out what we could about the Taliban's likely position on 3 key issues. First and foremost, the US had to be assured that never again would America be attacked by terrorists based in Afghanistan. We discovered that the Taliban were prepared to break with al-Qaeda, whom they blamed for bringing the United States bearing down on them in 2001. In other words, the Taliban had learned their lesson and there would be no repeat of 9/11. The second issue concerned Taliban non-recognition of the Afghan government, which they dismissed as puppets of the United States. Now, Taliban views on this matter were complex. However, they recognized that any future government would have to reflect the diverse views and aspirations of Afghan society and not be solely shaped by Islamic theology as it happened in the 1990s. The final issue concerned the sequencing of the ending of hostilities and the phased withdrawal of US troops. In private, the Taliban told us that they would tolerate a small US force remaining in Afghanistan for some time. Now, this was really significant because actually publicly they were saying all foreign forces had to be out before they would cease fighting. In 2013, Semple and I again met with senior Taliban, this time to negotiate a framework for local ceasefires. This actually held open the prospects for reducing conflict in a number of Afghan provinces. This was back in 2013. I got straight in a plane and went to Kabul to take our findings to the senior US military there. And unfortunately, our findings fell on deaf ears. And this was because the US military worried that the Taliban would take advantage of ceasefires to rebuild their forces. In 2016, Semple and I held a third round of talks with senior Taliban. What we discovered took us completely by surprise. At the time, the Taliban were sweeping across Afghanistan, and they had just appointed a new leader after the last one had been killed by a US drone. However, our talks revealed a Taliban movement that was exhausted by over a decade of fighting. Recent gains in the battlefield had come at great cost for them. And there was also very little trust in the new leader. This all suggested that there was appetite within the Taliban for peace talks, even after the United States had withdrawn most of its forces. The past 18 months have seen incredible progress in peace talks. Over 9 rounds of negotiation, the US, United States and the Taliban have struck a deal that closely follows what Semple and I had outlined in 2012 in terms of the Taliban breaking with al-Qaeda and the phased withdrawal of foreign forces. Unfortunately, the deal got derailed literally at the last minute. Now, these US-Taliban talks did not address the future of Afghan government, nor the protection of women's rights under any future power-sharing arrangements. And such matters were to be left to intra-Afghan talks to follow. These negotiations, when they do eventually happen, which they must, will be far tougher and more complex than US-Taliban talks. Trump is the reason for the amazing progress in peace talks and also for why the deal collapsed. Now, to be fair, Trump is an unlikely peacemaker. As president, he has threatened nuclear war against North Korea, almost gone to war against Iran, and reignited war in northern Syria. However, he is no fan of the war in Afghanistan. He has long promised to bring all US troops home. The 2020 presidential elections drove forward the recent talks towards a peace deal. And then Trump's ego took over. Against all advice, last month he invited the Taliban to meet with him in person at the presidential retreat in Camp David. Trump wanted to be seen to close the deal, and instead he caused the whole thing to unravel. For reasons that are still unclear, he called off the meeting and vowed that the US would hit the Taliban harder than ever before. Trump, the supposed peacemaker, showed his true colors. Afghanistan remains mired in conflict. In August, more civilians were killed in Afghanistan than in the conflicts in Syria and Yemen combined. The Afghan people have a long and difficult road ahead of them. However, talking to the Taliban remains the best hope for peace. Thank you.